Hello, and welcome to We Need to Talk About, a thing where I talk about things that I think we need to talk about. Today, we need to talk about Venezuela. I apologize in advance if this is a bit of a rambling episode because I'm no expert on Venezuela, but I feel a need to address some things that are not properly being addressed and draw some links between certain things and certain other things. Now, that sounds a bit mysterious, but I think the reason I feel a need to record this is because we have people trying to talk to anti imperialist leftists who are saying not to support the Venezuelan government. What bothers me about this whole thing is that it has an air of like, do you condemn Hamas about it? And the choice of bringing this up at this particular time, whether it is intended to or not, serves to blunt and dissipate opposition to imperial aggression. And the aggression should really be our number one concern at the moment. So, some background about Venezuela. It was the birthplace of Simon Bolivar, who was an anti imperialist who fought against the Spanish Empire and attempted to sort of create a singular Latin American polity, and or South American, perhaps. Sorry, I'm not sure which one. Anyway, so Venezuela was his home country. Bolivia is, of course, named after him, but we shouldn't confuse the two. But Venezuela has traditionally been perhaps less of an oligarchic country than some other Latin American countries, and has less of a caste sort of has had less of a caste system in terms of like various ethnic peoples. However, this started, or inequality started to creep in the mid 20th century, with a growing richer bourgeoisie tied to the petroleum export industry. So by the late 80s, early 90s, there was considerable unrest. And in 1992, I think it was, a man called Hugo Chavez, who was a man who had indigenous background, who'd risen through the ranks to become a colonel, I believe, in the Venezuelan military. He attempted a coup, and he was defeated and put in prison. He served a couple of years in prison for that. But when he came out, he determined to basically pursue the same end through legal means. And in 1998, he was swept to power in an election. After which, they had a constitutional process and created a new sort of constitution in Venezuela, and named it as a Bolivarian republic. So this was happening at the same time that very soon before the global war on terror broke out, so very soon before 9/11. And Venezuela is their economy is very oil dependent. They are a trade dependent nation, and the oil is their primary export. So the effect on oil prices of the global war on terror was, in fact, going to play a very large role in the US attitude towards Venezuela, as we'll see. And Venezuela has been under a very real and unrelenting attack for a quarter of a century from the US, and that attack has involved the US fomenting armed violence, including a mercenary incursion, as well as using a lot of systematic misinformation and disinformation, and of course brutal economic warfare, which culminated in 2017 in sweeping sanctions, but was certainly significant before then as well. And if we ever want to form an opinion or an analysis of events in Venezuela, to sort of pretend that those are not part of the formula is completely invalid. So I'll start by giving some personal background here, in that I want to point out I'm no believer in automatically supporting someone because of their political affiliation. I don't think that if someone calls themselves a socialist, you should necessarily give them support. And I disagree vehemently with those people in the past who made apologies for Soviet aggression. And I abhor the people who call themselves NATO anarchists, if such a thing even makes sense. And I believe that your personal armchair beliefs about the way the world should run are no reason for ignoring real world suffering inflicted on real people. Having said that, though, I do have questions about the timing and nature of those who have decided that we need to be told now exactly how terrible the Venezuelan regime is. The timing is interesting because one would not necessarily react to an imperial incursion in a country by saying that the most urgent thing is that people understand how terrible that regime is. Why is it suddenly important that everyone understands that? Why do they feel that this is the time that everyone needs to be told that you have to walk this fine line of opposing the US intervention, but at the same time also making sure you condemn the Venezuelan government? I can see why some people don't want to support the Venezuelan government on moral grounds, but some people claim that we all have to condemn the Venezuelan government or we will not seem to be credible to the public. Well, I think that's simply untrue. As activists, we are trying to communicate more broadly, and the simpler the message is, the stronger it is. I don't think you should chuck principle aside in order to make your message stronger, but the fact is that being able to say that the US is an imperialist power and they hate the legitimate government of Venezuela and they simply lie about all the terrible things that they say the Venezuelan government are doing is actually a much stronger point than saying, oh yes, no, they are bad, but what the US is doing is also bad and maybe it could make things worse. I mean, you're putting yourself in a much worse position to argue against the intervention if you concede that. So there is no practical argument. Again, I'm not advocating that we change our tune because of that. What I want to lay out is, in fact, there are all the very good reasons that aren't so instrumental that we could reject condemnation of the Maduro-led government. And also, the even more important reasons to stop trying to police or correct the people who actually feel comfortable supporting Maduro or the Bolivarian government in Venezuela. I want to bring into question the motives of people who are trying to get us to take a critical or condemnatory stance on the Venezuelan government. Even if they think they're acting in good faith, they're being actuated by something that is not really germane to the current moment. And so perhaps we shouldn't pay them that much heed. Of course, we also have another pressing example of a very similar thing now with the almost perennial unrest in Iran. Well, and I mean, I personally, I can't deny that the Iranian regime is repressive from my personal viewpoint. And people are trying to rise up against it. And we're put in this literal no-win situation where we either embrace the impulse to criticize the excesses of the Iranian regime and thus empower the interventionists, or we just, bury our heads in the sand about what we don't like about the Iranian government. So, with Iran, I don't think there is a great answer. I think one of the things we should bear in mind, though, is that we can't do anything really to help the Iranian people against their government. Pretty much anything we do to show solidarity with them in the domestic context becomes ammunition for the US empire to use against Iran and ultimately against them themselves. So, and I guess in a way, things have become a bit easier in this recent instance because they've been really blatant. Netanyahu came out in strong support of what the Iranian dissidents were doing, the protesters were doing, and Mike Pompeo literally tweeted the words, "Happy New Year to every Iranian in the streets, also every Mossad agent walking beside them." So, when unsurprisingly, large numbers of people have taken to streets in support of their government and against the violence committed by people who, although they might walk amongst genuine protesters, they are not genuine protesters. They're essentially foreign-backed armed forces. So, in this instance, I'm finding it a little bit easier to sort of just say I stand with the Iranian regime than I would have previously. I should say government, not regime. But to be fair, I'm inclined to call the US a regime as well. So I'm an equal opportunity user of the term regime. Now, with Venezuela, there are actually some very interesting extenuating circumstances around the Venezuelan government. And there are also reasons to believe or question a lot of what is being said about how bad they are. As I mentioned, the misinformation is just constant. So it's very, just because, there's, they lie a lot over and over again, it doesn't mean that any of the lies are necessarily true. I think you have to, if anything, it brings it into question. Anyway, sorry, I'm not saying that very coherently, but it's not that the government are necessarily squeaky clean, but we also can't demand absolute perfection. I mean, if China invaded Australia and killed 80 Australian soldiers and civilians, we would not approach the issue through the lens of the Australian government's treatment of Indigenous people and asylum seekers. We should live by principles and not chuck these principles out the window whenever it serves us. But at the same time, if something is 95% lies, then it's basically all a lie. I'm not saying that that's the case here, but I think we need to put in perspective how much we're being told about repression and nastiness by the Venezuelan government is actually clearly a lie. Now, one of the reasons that I'd question a lot of what is being said about Venezuela is that none of the things being claimed at the moment are new. And a lot of them are actually repetitions of things that have been proven to be lies in the past. A lot of the things they're accused of now they've been accused of again and again and again for nearly 30 years. So if you watch the documentary, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, for example, you'll get some idea of what was going on in 2002 with regards to Venezuela. And one of the key repetitions in this history is the repetition of rigged elections. And it's very crucial because they're using the idea of the government being illegitimate as a way of legitimating their own behaviour. That's very, very important to the US legal case for having kidnapped Maduro, and they can't prosecute him if he's a head of state. So they have to claim that he's not the legitimate head of state. So, we can't ignore the past lies and just treat the 2024 election in isolation. So Owen Jones recently said that there could be no doubt about the legitimacy of the 2013 election, which he personally observed, but he also said that there could be no doubt that the 2024 election was illegitimate when he didn't observe it. So I think you can kind of, even from that just one instance, you can see that there might be a problematic discourse here. Now, Western media and governments said that 2013 was a rigged election. They say every Venezuelan election was a rigged election. But the Venezuelan election system, as well, is quite interesting. It was clearly set up to be tamper-proof, or as tamper-proof as possible. So they set up this very secure election system, and every election they invite lots of international observers to come and see it. And that kind of, to me, suggests that they are worried that someone else is going to rig their election, not the government, And so, I mean, I think we have to take that into account. And in 2016, they had an election for the National Assembly, and the opposition won that election. Then, I mean, 3 of the National Assembly members were then removed after it was found that they cheated. And it sounds not ideal, but it sounds like a system that's working. So they controlled the National Assembly, and then when it came to the 2018 election, the presidential election, they called for a boycott. So there was a low turnout, and it's possible that, given that, they also, I mean, I'm not going to get into the details of what candidates are and aren't allowed to run and why. I mean, this is, I think I think that a government can legitimately stop people from running for some reasons. So those arguments, I don't have the time to go into that, and I think that we would be foolish to assume that because they're stopping certain candidates from running or stopping parties who received less than 1% in the previous election from running, that is necessarily this big repressive move. We need to actually take that on a case-by-case basis and work out what's going on. So anyway, they boycotted this election. It was a low turnout. They maybe could have won the presidency had they run someone, but they didn't. Instead, they clearly had a different plan, because they then declared, they used a constitutional trick to try and do a parliamentary coup, declaring Juan Guaido the actual president. And there was no sense in this, because under the clauses in the Constitution they were citing, the person who should have taken over as president was the vice president. So it made no sense in that way to appoint Juan Guaido, but it was accompanied by a lot of violence and attempts to persuade the military to come over to his side, and then basically a whole bunch of countries declaring him to be the legitimate president. So it was this kind of sick attempt to kind of brute force their way into the presidency by pretending that he was president. Sick, but also kind of comical in a way. But people died, so it wasn't actually funny. So the countries that recognize Guaido are almost all, and it was only about a quarter of the countries in the world. We should remember that. Of course, they consider themselves to be, the international community, but it's the Western countries and a few of their lackeys. And those ones that recognize Guaido are almost all exactly the ones that say that that refuse to recognize the 2024 election and say that Maduro is not the real president. And when you hear the Secretary of State that say that over 50 countries don't recognize Maduro, you should remember there is a couple of hundred countries in the world. So over a quarter isn't that big a deal, really. Um, Now, the 2024 election, clearly shenanigans have gone on. The election authorities there claim that they were hacked. And again, I think if we want to understand this, someone actually needs to look into whether, well, I mean, let's face it, of course the US is going to be trying to rig their election. Anyone who thinks that they're not doing that is a complete idiot. So we need to actually understand how they tried to, whether it succeeded or whether it has a bearing on the result, and why the Venezuelan election officials won't produce the paper trail and the normal evidence to back up the legitimacy of their election, which they have done in the past. Meanwhile, we're supposed to believe that Maria Corina Machado's chosen proxy won the election. Now, we have Western polls saying, like an exit poll said that he won nearly 80% of the vote and Maduro won 15%. So, for a start, I think that speaks to the credibility of what the West is claiming, because that is clearly false. And also, like Machado, although they've managed to get people talking about this ludicrous story that Trump didn't give her the presidency because he was miffed about the Nobel Prize, and even to the extent of giving the story more legs with this insane bit of theatre where she hands over her prize to him and he takes this grinning thing. I mean, I think what you have to understand is Trump is a clown for a reason. That's his job. His job is to be a clown. But the fact is that the sober analysis, that isn't just one source saying they heard a conversation one time, is that Machado simply doesn't have enough support within Venezuela to govern. I mean, the thing about that, one of the things that's been true ever since the Bolivarian Revolution is that the opposition has been split. They haven't united behind any one person. There's been a lot of infighting, and so even when the Bolivarian government or their candidate, Chavez or Maduro, might not have enthusiastic support from 51% of the population, they still managed to win elections because, and not just the presidential election, but municipal elections are very strong and and obviously they lost the National Assembly that one time, but other times they have had that as well. So, I mean, the thing is that Machado is, there is no way in hell that Machado's chosen candidate won 80% of the vote, but they might have just won the vote, but then, I mean, there is still very credible possibility that Maduro won the vote. So you could say that Maduro stole the election, but there are literally dozens of legitimate questions that need answering before that claim can be considered valid. Until they're answered, I think the conservative position, the intellectually justified position, is to reject the claim of a rigged election because we've been told that claim so many times in the past and it's been proven a lie. It would be stupid to kind of believe it now. In the immortal words of George W. Bush, you can't get fooled again. So that history gives you some sort of framework to work from when there's certain things, when we're considering the validity of claims about the legitimacy of Maduro's presidency. And there are other things that we can add to that framework. So one is the class division in Venezuela, which you can clearly see in that film, The Revolution Cannot Be Televised. I think this informs maybe the beliefs of certain Venezuelan people that from the more privileged classes that may genuinely believe a lot of things that aren't true. You can see in that movie bourgeois people who either will not or do not or can't understand the perspective of poor people at all. And another thing shown in the movie is the consistent lying of the privately owned news media in Venezuela. And this feeds that sort of bourgeois chauvinism, because the private media misrepresent the actions of the government under Chavez, or they did back then, and then that reinforces these ideas that this isn't a real socialist government. It's just a bunch of people stealing everything for themselves and leaving people to wallow in misery. But the one thing about that is that it always seems to be these people from fairly well-to-do backgrounds who see things that way. And when, over the years, I've noticed when you see poor people, they tend to side more with the government. It has changed, obviously, since 2017 and the sanctions and all of the people leaving Venezuela. But previously, at least, the contrast was quite stark, and I think it's quite telling. The lies that come out of the Venezuelan news media kind of feed a discourse that creates a false image that is actually contradicted by statistics about, for example, the reduction in extreme poverty, which was very stark. Also, a general reduction in less extreme poverty, increase in education, and so forth. Anyway, to go back to the documentary, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, another thing that is quite pertinent going forward from 2002 to today is the central event of the documentary, which is a kind of false flag terror event, which melded with a coordinated deception operation run basically as a psychological operation by the privately owned news media. So what happened was that snipers shot at Chavistas who were gathering outside the Miraflores presidential palace, and they killed many of them. And then these supporters of Chavez some of them had guns, and they returned fire at where they thought the snipers were shooting from. So there was an overbridge, and they were filmed returning fire, and then the private news media put out a deceptively edited footage using angles that concealed what was the road beneath the overpass, and then used that to lie and say that the people firing these handguns were firing into an unarmed crowd of right-wing counter-protesters. Now, one of the things about this is, like a coordinated plan, and they had already, in advance of these events, they'd already recorded the coup leader announcing his takeover of the government in response to this violence, which they then kind of inadvertently revealed on air, or perhaps arrogantly revealed on air, that they'd recorded the announcement before the violence had actually happened. Anyway, either way, the response to the coup from the people of Venezuela was a massive opposition, and they rose up in numbers and surrounded the presidential palace And basically, after 2 days, the coup leaders stood down. So this part of history is very, I don't know, it's very relevant to our current moment. But another element of, I think, is pertinent is the history of US hybrid warfare. So the US has developed over many years these destabilization techniques, including like economic warfare, psychological warfare, including propaganda and all of that sort of stuff. These are common techniques for the US to use against enemies or any sort of impediment to its global domination. So after World War II, the US became quite obsessed with a whole bunch of different things that kind of form a bit of have a common theme, like special operations, special forces operations, psychological warfare, destabilize operations, and regime change, and so forth. So with psychological warfare, you had people like Edward Lansdale working in the Philippines who developed military tactics of psychological warfare. And Lansdale was an advertising executive who joined I think he joined the OSS during World War II. And he tried to use psychology as a force multiplier against leftist insurgents, and this was pretty much all sort of megalomaniacal sort of stuff, like a bit of a power trip in some ways. But this was happening at the same time as the CIA was also getting into drugs and mind control and elaborate mass deception schemes. And again, like quite a power trip sort of thing, but also, something that where they could get productive results out of some of this stuff. And, it's widely reported that they gave up on their ideas of mind control, but that, that doesn't mean that things didn't come out of the program that allow them to give them extra abilities in terms of mass deception and so forth. So then at the same time, there are a lot more sober and scholarly efforts to harness like area studies, ethnology, anthropology, human geography, and so forth to create a tactical soft power system where you can recruit locals, with regional differences and so forth, in your own operations against a local government also, and so forth. So this famously was the job of the so-called A teams in Vietnam and in Laos, who went in and worked with local indigenous peoples to attack the central government. Attack the communist-led forces, I should say, because of course in South Vietnam the central government was a US ally. Anyway, so this all was combined with this massive growth in covert action that grew out of intelligence agencies. Now, of course, intelligence is supposed to be the gathering of intelligence, but by nature, espionage lent itself to this kind of covert action operation. So running an agent for intelligence led to running an agent for sabotage or whatever, or regime change operations. So the covert action branch of intelligence became more and more prominent, and this really got put into practice in 1953 in Iran when the US took over a British attempt to overthrow the Iranian government, and then afterwards in Guatemala. So that was 53 in Iran and 54 in Guatemala. So the way it worked is that they had economic destabilization. They co-opted personnel to commit acts of sabotage. They hired people to go out into the streets as fake protesters, often creating mayhem and violence. It's sort of like what we'd now call astroturfing, fake dissidents, and they, they had this fake controlled dissent. Um, And so it began with Iraq and Guatemala, but this methodology has been spread in a great many different regime change operations. It's become far more and more sophisticated until we reached the kind of colour revolution sort of stage. And now the US has a kind of permanent regime change industry, with the overt tip of that iceberg, because there's a lot that's hidden from us, of course. The overt tip of it is called democracy promotion, working through particularly the National Endowment for Democracy, which kind of foments discontent in all these countries under the guise of criticizing their anti-democratic nature, which is, I mean, some of them are anti-democratic, but that's neither here nor there. Certainly of no interest to the United States. So in these circumstances, and this is really a global system, in these circumstances, effectively any dissent against any of the US, whether or not it's justified, has US fingers in there, and there is, whether they want to or not, they become tools of covert destabilization. What we've seen in this century is that part of what's going on is that the discontent and the protests are becoming more and more violent, starting to become more and more like armed insurgencies. So in the Cold War, the US was in the enviable position where it could use its economic might, its covert action repertoire that I mentioned earlier, and its huge soft power to turn any sort of pluralism, political pluralism or political liberalism or like free speech constitution against enemy regimes. And then should they crack down on those things, they could, of course, point the finger at them and say, well, look at that, our enemies are dictatorial and repressive. So either way, they're kind of winning in that. So Venezuela, after the Bolivarian Revolution, made the choice of allowing freedom of expression to remain, presumably hoping that, like, the facts would counter the propaganda. And I mean, I think it was probably the right decision. Certainly, at first, what happened was that there was a lot of popular support at home and a lot of popular support and legitimacy for the regime abroad. However, I think in the long run, we can also see that it has allowed this constant chipping away, and until, enough throwing shit at the wall until some of it sticks, sort of thing. But with the violence we see, like in the 2002 Venezuelan coup attempt and the 2014 coup in Ukraine, and also subsequent violence in Venezuela as well, a lot of the violence seems to be aimed at turning the people against the authorities. So in the Maidan, snipers shot both protesters and police. And it was clearly trying to provoke the police into attacking protesters. And some of those protesters also, people on the barricades there had sometimes military armaments as well, which I don't know. I thought that was striking. It seemed to just go straight over the head of the Western media. I'd show pictures of someone with a folding stock submachine gun and I almost said submarine gun, but submachine gun, and the barricades, and it was like apparently completely unremarkable to them. But as someone who's been at a few protests, I think if someone showed up with a submachine gun next to me, I'd find it something to be remarked upon. But that's just me, perhaps. I don't know. Anyway, so there's infiltration of violence into these protest movements, which are perhaps partly genuine and perhaps partly astroturfed anyway, is another trend. And we know in the recent unrest in Iran that there was hundreds of deaths amongst police and militia and military. The biggest pro-government protest in Tehran happened with the funeral of 100 police officers, a mass funeral of 100 police officers. So it gives you a bit of a scale of how many were killed on that side. And we are, of course, hearing about many, many, many killed by security forces as well. And of course, well, we can take the higher numbers with a grain of salt, but clearly there was violence against protesters too. This hasn't been covered much by the West, and they also decided not to show the footage of people with firearms firing from at the security forces, such as have been seen on Grey Zone. I mean, I think this is part of a larger project that the US has been kind of working on since World War II, where it seems to want to blur the distinction between combatant and non-combatant anyway. I don't really, I guess I can't really get into that, but I feel that it's very much connected with the ongoing kind of imposition of a violence-based system of governance coming to a booted down front door near you soon, I think. Sadly. Anyway, in 2017, the West reported violence in Venezuela as being a very simple kind of story of people rising up against repressive government commits violence against them. When in actuality, when independent reporters such as Abby Martin went, they found that the violence was far from one-sided. There were gangs of right-wing thugs riding around on motorcycles and scooters, attacking people, including finding isolated policemen and killing them by setting them on fire and burning them to death. Now, I think that is to me, that seems very likely to be aimed at causing the police to overreact and attack protesters. But as well as that, these same thugs were going around and they were killing leftists, unionists, community organisers, and so forth. They're basically fascist thugs. So I think we can't buy the simple narrative of a bad government against the people's will, because we can't separate the dissent from the US input of astroturfing, money, guns, subversion, coercion, psychological operations, misinformation, disinformation, etc. So if we look at the issue of political prisoners in Venezuela, for example, many of them may be innocent, they may be denied due process, and they might be subject to mistreatment or even torture. These are all real issues. But what can't be said is that they are therefore the government doesn't have a reasonable pretext for locking them up. They are they're accused of not of like posting something on Twitter. They're accused of partaking in armed insurrection. So whether they whether it's true or not is something else. But the fact is that this armed insurrection isn't the figment of a paranoid dictator's fever dreams. This is real. This is real. This actually happens all the time in Venezuela. So ever since the Bolivarian Revolution, there's been destabilization. And we've got the issue of trying to distinguish between things caused by the Venezuelan government and things that are actually coming out of interference from the US and disloyal elements amongst the wealthy in Venezuela. The unfortunate reality is we can't really separate the two things. Like people, often like if you say, well, what about the US? People say, oh, you're just anti-American, blah, blah, blah. It's just an excuse. You're supporting the dictator because of the so on. We've heard this over Iraq and other countries, previously Libya and so forth, like that it's anti-American to say that the US might be in part, or it's anti-American to say that they have a nasty role in fomenting the Ukraine war, for example, even though some of them had kind of said outright that they wanted to provoke the US, to provoke Russia into invading Ukraine. But anyway, I mean, I would love to live in a world where we just go, well, this person is agential, this regime is agential. We look at what they do and they do only, and we take that in isolation. But that world doesn't exist. And the fact is that the US, once they get their claws in anywhere, they never leave. They never leave. Right? Once they build a military base, they've got a military base there forever. They'll always have boots on the ground. The Philippines chucked them out for a little bit, but they were back less than a decade later. Even Cam Ranh Bay, their main naval base in Vietnam, when they were fighting against the people of Vietnam, even there, you know, they were supposedly defeated by Vietnam. Even there, that base is now a US military base again. And in Latin America, it goes even deeper. There is no such thing as an independent Latin American country that can be held fully responsible for its own actions. I mean, I know it's unsatisfactory. It's not great at all, but that is the reality. And to pretend otherwise or to yell at people for being anti-American because they try and bring it up is completely invalid. So I think this is a good reason for having quite a lenient view on the actions of the Venezuelan government, especially when it comes to the question of the economy. Torturing people, for example, I mean, that's on them. But the economy stuff, which is central to a lot of the complaints, that is definitely very hard to sort of say, well, that's all the Venezuelan government fault, you know. Also, I mean, I don't personally know for sure that they've tortured people. By the way, I'm not saying that they definitely torture people. Just to clear that up. Anyway, we're told that the Bolivarian government is just a cabal of kleptocrats who enrich themselves under a false guise of socialism. But we're also told that this socialism itself is bad and wrong and never works, and it causes people to suffer and people end up in misery because of its inefficiencies. So, I mean, there is an obvious contradiction there. In reality, like, the US has been backing economic sabotage from the beginning in in Venezuela, and even though the oil was nationalized before the Bolivarian Revolution, U.S. oil companies pulled out, and like it has made great difficulties for their economy. They've had like an oil strike that seems to have been astroturfed back in the early 2000s and so forth. And this all culminated in 2017 when the sanctions went to become sectoral sanctions. So they're affecting all of the people. There's an economist called Mark Weisbrot who brought this up, although I don't think he's the one who originated these figures. But the estimates of the increased mortality that came from those 2017 sanctions, directly came from those sanctions, are that a minimum of 40,000 people lost their lives prematurely and up to 100,000. So when people complain about the misery caused by the Maduro government, remember what they're choosing to ignore, because we've got very, very good evidence that the US has caused misery and death amongst Venezuelan people. Now, why is the US doing this? Well, the US has a real problem with Venezuela. It has a real problem with pretty much all oil producing countries, really. It's got to, because of the way it's set up, its global hegemony, it has to deal with all of them in one way or another. Now, Venezuela has heavy crude oil, and you will have heard it has the highest known proven oil reserves in the world, but it is heavy oil. It costs more to refine. Now, the Middle East has light, sweet oil, that's non-acidic oil, that is a lot cheaper to refine. So what happened was that the US, which has its own oil, the US went into Iraq. Now, the kind of assumption there is that that's either to take the oil or it's not related to the oil, but it's neither. It's to keep the oil in the ground more than anything else. The attack on Iraq caused oil prices to go up massively, and they've never really come back down to where they were previously. It caused ExxonMobil to become the most valuable private corporation in the history of the world at the time. So it was very profitable to not take the oil. And you have to understand that, as well as the fact that in not taking the oil, the US also gave itself a lot more strategic power, itself and its allies. So it's important, for example, that North Sea oil remain profitable. Otherwise, it's hard to justify getting it out of the ground. And the same goes to tar sands and so forth. Now, I could go on about where the US is going with fracking and stuff like that, but the fact is that the US is definitely doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on this path, even as renewables are becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And I think a lot of what's happening in the world relates to that. But I won't go into that. I'll just point out that one of the results of the rise in oil prices, it meant that the comparatively uneconomical Venezuelan crude, which costs a lot more to refine and thus has a much lower profit margin, became in essence or close to as profitable as like Iraqi or Saudi crude. That was a problem for the US because Venezuela, now under the socialist government, started using that money for things that were inconvenient for the US. They became the biggest aid donors in South America. They started building up soft power funding, things like Telesur. They created UNASUR, or founded UNASUR, a kind of a South American economic cooperation group between South American states. So all of these things obviously are a problem for US domination. And the US can pretend all it wants that really it's all about ideology and how they believe in freedom, and they don't think that socialism is freedom or whatever. But it's just, let's be actually realistic. These people also at times are very, very, very honest about their world domination aspirations. And they're more than aspirations. They basically do dominate the world. So another piece of context about what happened in 2002 and what happened in 2025 is that from 2001, Hugo Chavez was a major critic of the US war on terror, and was off, he was, I wouldn't say toast of the town, but he had this kind of international legitimacy. And he famously went into the UN General Assembly and implied that, sort of mocked Bush as being a kind of satanic and evil person by saying he smelt sulfur in there. So now fast forward to 2023, and one of the most outspoken voices against the Gaza Holocaust, although he certainly never commanded the same international attention as Chavez, was Maduro. So, I think that also needs to be borne in mind, that this is, these people are inconvenient for the US. So, another bit of context is that the repetition of lies that I've mentioned already. But, the sources in the Venezuelan news media, who often are just making stuff up, are repeated in the Western news media. And I think that stuff that if we knew where it came from, we might actually look at more skeptically, is taken on board by the Western media, and we shouldn't. So, for example, they said that Hugo Chavez's daughter was the richest woman in Venezuela or Latin America, or whatever, and there was no evidence at all to back that up, apart from the fact that she wore expensive clothes when she was working as a diplomat in New York. I think also her spouse or her in-law or something was involved in some sort of deal where something was sold for like 3 times the price you would expect, but he was taken to court in Venezuela, and the court decided that that was actually not an unreasonable markup because of the risks involved in the trade. And I think that's a really interesting point, because what's happened with these targeted sanctions that have been going on for quite a long time now is that people who work in state functions, if they are put under targeted sanctions, which is what the US government does, and we've got some idea of how onerous targeted sanctions are by the testimony of people like ICC judges who found that suddenly their whole lives are turned upside down because the US has decided to sanction them. So these are not a joke. So these people who state functionaries are having to go around doing an ordinary government business with in or with other countries as if they were doing clandestine deals. So it doesn't mean that they're necessarily trying to steal stuff. Of course, it makes it a lot easier for them to steal stuff, I suppose. But it's because they can't do deals in the open. And now I think this relates a little bit to the fact that two of Maduro's nephews were arrested in 2015 in what may have been a kind of a frame job where they were kind of they were arrested for many tons of cocaine. They were in Haiti at the time, I believe, arrested by the DEA, I think, and prosecuted and put in prison. And what, you would think, well, that could be true. Except in retrospect, it looks pretty false. And the reason is because at the time they said, well, this is a sure sign that there are these, that the Venezuelan government is involved in this massive cocaine trafficking enterprise and that it's a major source of cocaine coming into the US. And the thing is that that's back then, and that cocaine trade has been proven to be untrue. We know it's untrue. So it seems a lot like they were creating that narrative through this arrest to try and justify actions against Venezuela. At least that makes sense to me. And of course, with the irregularity of of business, the way business is done for Venezuelan officials, either in an official capacity or trying to support the political party, which is supposedly what they were selling the cocaine for. It's very difficult to tell real from fake in this instance, and I would actually tend to think that this was a setup. So, and of course, in the meantime, we have very little mention. While the mainstream media likes to give credence to US claims about Venezuelan government involvement in trafficking drugs, they're not going to talk too much about Marco Rubio's own background in drug trafficking, or, admittedly he's not directly implicated, but he's certainly connected to that, and also the Fort Bragg cartel, who were participants in the military raid into Venezuela, the invasion of Venezuela and kidnapping of Maduro. So you basically got like people who genuinely are drug traffickers, like kidnapping people and accusing them of being drug traffickers, to put not too fine a point on it. Anyway, so there's no real evidence, there's no compelling evidence of Bolivarian corruption, Bolivarian drug dealing, Bolivarian, these billions of dollars that they're supposed to have stolen from the people of Venezuela who would otherwise be living the high life or whatever. But there is very direct evidence of economic sabotage by the US and deadly sanctions by the US that are an act of war, and they're an act of war because they're more than just sanctions. They're effectively a blockade, and this is what's happened with US sanctions, because they're enforcing other countries to also follow their sanctions. They're basically blockading countries. And there needs to be a legal challenge on that, especially with finance. But even with trade, they're stopping other people's trade from going in. So it seems ridiculous to go on about what the Maduro government may or may not have done when we've got all this stuff done by the US right in front of our eyes. And in repression too, we shouldn't hold Venezuela to a higher standard than we expect of other places that aren't suffering under US hybrid warfare. So if we look at the report submitted to the UN Human Rights Council by Michelle Bachelet, there are things to criticise Venezuela over. However, the number of things directly known by that UN team from interviews are the nature of those things is serious, but the scale is not high, and which may reflect the limitations of investigators. But also we need to understand that limitation. So, but at the same time, the way it was reported, the New York Times reported the report as saying that it had discovered thousands of people killed by the Venezuelan government that the Venezuelan government had covered up. Whereas in fact, the figures that they got on those thousands of people came from the Venezuelan government itself. It was its own reporting. So the New York Times, of course, wow, what a surprise. They lie. Woohoo. Anyway, so now what they did have was testimonies from victims saying that that security forces were using drop weapons and so forth to imply that the people they'd murdered had in fact been legitimate targets, legitimate insurrectionaries and so forth. But there is something about that. If they're using drop weapons, it means that there must be some genuine possibility of people using those weapons as insurrectionaries, and thus there must be a possibility that there was actual firefight leading to people dying. So that some of the people killed by the government are not murdered. And nothing in that report will tell us the proportion, the numbers of people who were murdered or who died in legitimate security actions. And remember this, when you know there's been continuous bouts of armed violence in Venezuela from right-wing people trying to overthrow the government or destabilize the government. So the Bachelet report reminds me a bit of the UN report into sexual violence on October the 7th that seemed to confirm the existence of mass rape without actually having any evidence of it. Now, I'm not saying that the Bachelet report has no evidence of what it's talking about, but rather that, like that other report, it totally ignores the context of what's going on. It follows the same practice of giving the benefit of the doubt against the accused. And the logic seems to be that if there's a powerful sovereign actor, then they do need to answer for anything. If you establish something happened, then they don't have real excuses. The buck stops with them. But the problem is that that's not the case here. The Venezuelan government is not this all-powerful sovereign actor. There is another party involved here. At one point, the Bachelet report dismisses Venezuelan claims that poor access to healthcare are due to the impact of US sanctions. That the government says are stopping it from delivering healthcare, such as like being unable to access immunizations, which vaccines was a big problem at the time. But the report says that the government's responsibilities are non-derogable. And this is after the report itself documents that 75% of the Venezuelan government budget goes on health and social services. So exactly how much they think they should do beyond that is anyone's guess. But if the report really wanted to give an accurate view of human rights violations in Venezuela, it would need to include the role of the US and of non-state actors like this to put everything in its true context. The fact is that like the sanctions by the US are designed to turn the population against the government. And the only way you can do that is by inflicting pain on them. And the US officials have admitted this many times over with other countries. They are meant to inflict collective punishment. And as I've mentioned, they kill people. So the Bachelet report really is like the report into sexual violence on October the 7th, in that it's a slanted and deliberately restricted and narrow report that actually furthers the ends of the people conducting a genocidal assault that is killing thousands of innocent people. So when we hear about repression in Venezuela, we do need to take into account that there is a lot of falsehood out there. There is a lot of misinformation and disinformation about them. So maybe the problems of the country are caused by the government are not radical. They're not entrenched. They might be serious, but they're not necessarily intractable or symptomatic of the Bolivarian government per se. There seems to be better evidence for the counterfactual claim that without US interference, the Venezuelan government would have been relatively benign than there is for the equally counterfactual contention that without US imperialism, the Venezuelan government would still be repressive. So in fact, if you weigh the evidence, it's not even close. Now, one of the things we've been hearing from those that would tell us not to support the Venezuelan government is a kind of nihilistic view from these Venezuelans who say that all of the sides are bad, which I think is tailored to an anti-imperialist audience who are hardly going to support the US. And they say things like that there's no such thing as left nor right, that you can't trust any party, and so forth. So I feel they're speaking directly to left-wing activists and saying it's all bad, all sides are bad, and they're all as bad as each other. There was a guest on Flashpoint's radio who basically said there's no such thing as left or right, and that one lot pretends to be on the side of the poor, and that's not really true, while the opposition pretends to be on the side of the rich, and that's also not true. I mean, it almost sounded like parody, but if you step back for a second, you can see why it would serve the interests of US imperialists to say this, to erode a sense of solidarity, to make people hesitate about stepping forward in defense of the Venezuelan government. And this was a point made by Josephine Varghese, who said that some of the stuff sounds exactly like what the CIA would want you to hear. And that is undeniable, wherever it comes from. So when leftists hear a complaint about repression by a Venezuelan, they tend to defer on the basis that oppressed people should be believed. And of course, there are other Venezuelans who support the Bolivarian government, but I think we have an understandable habit of dismissing loyalists as being ignorant or biased. I certainly feel that way about people who defend my government. So those people who support the Venezuelan government are also Venezuelan. So we can't simply privilege, like these Venezuelans and say, well, they're telling us we can't be supportive of the Maduro government. So we have to go with that. And often as well, the loyalist Venezuelans, if you look, especially if you go through the history, going back for a long time, the loyalist Venezuelans seem often to be the poorer and more vulnerable people, and often the people who have a much longer record of devoting their lives to trying to uplift the poorer and more vulnerable. So I guess the point I would make is that there's a difference between standing on principle against a repressive regime and being a CIA dupe. But if you're a lazy, self-satisfied Westerner, you might not make the distinction. Malcolm X once said, if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppression. So my suggestion is to be careful instead of doing what makes you feel smug. Few of the people you hear condemning Maduro are likely to be working directly for the CIA, but some of them sound a lot like they should be sending them an invoice for services rendered. So the nihilism they spread is also, I think it's all about more than just Venezuela. It's an ideology that they like to spread, and it's a long-standing part of the propaganda that the U.S. empire is putting out there, because they're trying to break up any notion that we could have a high-level collective sort of socialism at all, especially not a national government level. So we have to accept instead a kind of depoliticized politics. You know, if we exercise any democratic power at all, it is merely to choose who we think is the best manager. You know, we can relate this back to the slogans like there is no alternative and so forth. And this is basically about the idea that really people who the people who pretend to be to offer an alternative to the poor are just trying to win elections, and that's an old trope that goes back to well, maybe it doesn't go back to the actual populares in Rome, but it certainly goes back to hundreds of years of people's interpretation of Roman history. So the populares in Rome were people who were on the side of the people against their people, who were openly on the side of oligarchy, who were called optimates. And it's almost fascinating to see how symptomatic it is, the way people talk about the different positions in Roman history, and what they will excuse on the part of optimates and what they sneer at on the part of populares. Michael Parenti wrote a book called The Murder of Julius Caesar, which tackles this in part, and I would recommend that. And of course, in our current moment, this rears its ugly head as a kind of horseshoe theory sort of thing, that like it's only the managerial types in the middle who can be trusted. The other people, they're all just trying to whip up the mob, and basically Hitler and Gandhi and Stalin and Mao and all of that, they're all just the same, Anyway, so it does relate to these people who think of themselves as centrists, or even centre leftists, but they're basically right-wing people who think that the centre is defined by their beliefs. So, they can be extremely right-wing, and they kind of spread this sense of nihilism, and they like the idea of technocracy because it sounds like it's neutral, but in reality it's where you give pretty much unmitigated power to right-wing ideologues who are often violently racist, but who are considered neutral or centrist because the political manifestos they follow, like zealots, are classified in our stupid system as being economics. And this has reached the point now we're moving beyond this kind of bureaucratic sense of technocracy to where we're kind of moving more towards a feudal overlord system, like where the concepts of merit and genius and worth and so forth have reached a peak where, on the one hand, they're pretty obviously ridiculous, because you look at the kind of billionaire buffoons and Bond villains like Trump and Musk and Thiel and Allison, and they are not impressive. But on the other hand, in the world of elite power, they still are impressive. They still, like, that's what they, the billions they have are merit in that system, which makes them geniuses, and you can't question them. From an historical perspective, it's kind of, I don't want to do the old mention of Hitler thing, but of course this was the glamour that Hitler exerted over people. He had, as an outsider and as a nonconformist, he was able to do things that impressed people, but were actually of limited use. But it built up this myth of infallibility, and I feel like in that sense, and in that sense only, not talking about any other senses, it's like we have a whole bunch of Hitlers running the world at the moment. Anyway, I only mention this because governance by these pathetic weirdos is kind of the reductio ad absurdum that shows what's fundamentally wrong with the concept of technocracy. Of course, when we're having this idea that Gaza is going to be run by a technocratic board of peace, which involves Donald Trump. Anyway, so what's actually happening in Venezuela, though? And what's going to happen? And I can see a model for where this is going. And that model is the Palestinian Authority. Things, I think, with Fatah and the Palestinian Authority came to a head when it was quite some time ago now, when Yasser Arafat was surrounded in his compound and threatened with death if he didn't concede to things that he really had no power to concede. So Israel and the US had long been, as part of their peace process, demanding effectively that the Palestinian Authority repudiate human rights for all Palestinians outside of the occupied territories. And it's not like the Palestinian Authority has any ability or legitimacy to do that. So once that happened, and I think the Camp David, Oslo type process was brutal enough for them. But after that, they simply put in a position where the carrots being offered become absolutely minuscule, and the stick becomes very, very, very big. And they didn't just say, well, do what we'll say will kill you, but they're like, do what we'll say will kill you, then we will destroy your memory. So we'll kill you twice by dragging your name through the mud afterwards, and we will attack your people and do much worse things to them than we would do if you complied. So your dying will be in vain. And, so comply, and we'll give you a bit of money. And that works for the US because it manages to create, the corruption becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, the Palestinian Authority are not, to my mind, the legitimate power in Palestine. because they don't have popular support. But we are all caught in this. We have this no-win situation where, because of the cowardly shittiness of all of our governments, all of the UN governments, including not just the Western governments, all of them, they're supporting the PA as the legitimate leaders of Palestine. And so if we want to achieve anything for the Palestinian people, we have to support them through the state sovereignty led by the PA. And I mean, it's a terrible situation, and I think it shows the extent to which the US can use its power to tie people in knots. But also don't blame the Palestinian Authority for being what they are, because they were never given a choice. And I think this is what they want to achieve with the Venezuelan regime. They want a controlled enemy. They want a subservient enemy. Now, we already saw this with Delcy Rodriguez to some extent. So Trump gets up and says, oh, Delcy Rodriguez is working with us. And her first speech was kind of defiant. But, people took the piss out of Trump. But the fact is, we're already seeing that there is truth to that. And also Gustavo Petro in Colombia is he also, he legitimated the US actions rhetorically. And it's not a huge thing, but it shows how much leverage they have over even their enemies. So they want a subservient enemy who they can grind under their heels, and they want to force them to dance like an organ grinder's monkey and still say they're the baddies and still say we're enemies with you. And they want this with Iran too. And in the meantime, of course, they're not going to invest anything into Venezuelan oil. They're not going to rebuild the infrastructure or anything like that. They're not there to take the oil. I mean, it would be counterproductive from their perspective to rebuild Venezuela's oil capacity, because Venezuela could nationalize it again or exert control over it through democratic or constitutional means. It's far better to leave it in the ground. And when it's interesting, and I think symptomatic of how lunatic our current situation is, that when ExxonMobil commented that Venezuela was uninvestable, that Trump threw a hissy fit, but the shareholders also threw a hissy fit, because they punished them with a massive drop in the share price because they were silly enough to be honest. Anyway, so back to where activists should stand. Once upon a time, Western leftists supported the Khmer Rouge, or some of them did anyway, and that was bad. Though, to be fair, it probably didn't make one bit of difference to anyone's life in Kampuchea. But it can be hard knowing what is right, but it's a lot easier than it used to be. I mean, if people knew back then that the US was secretly supporting the Khmer Rouge, then they might have maybe thought twice about their own enthusiastic embrace of the Maoist, extreme Maoist tendencies of the Khmer Rouge. Anyway, the fact is that the US is by far the worst threat to humanity that faces us, and they play a harmful role in nearly every bad thing that happens on our planet. Not least the wars in Ukraine, the Gaza Holocaust, the brutal civil war in Sudan, and the seemingly endless slaughter in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And you don't need to love enemies of the US, but when they're attacked by the US, you do need to shut the fuck up about it. You know, nobody is forcing you to express support for Hamas or Maduro or the Iranian government. But at the same time, no one needs to hear your bourgeois Western high horse reckons about human rights records, especially if they should choose to stand in solidarity with those regimes, if they feel comfortable saying, this is the legitimate government and I support them, then shut up. So that's my advice. And thank you very much for listening, /watching, /telepathically just intuiting this through the ether or something. And I will catch you next time.